Good evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with you on the 17th of November. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your local weather information from the National Weather Service. You can dial in at 1-800-472-0391. That's the Alaska Weather Information Line. Of course, you can find us online at weather.gov/Alaska. That is your online resource to any one of the number of services provided from the National Weather Service and NOAA for that matter. So if you're looking for information with your satellite and radar pictures, your local weather observations, your river stream gauge from the Alaska Pacific River Forecast Center, general aviation concerns and forecasts there from the Alaska Aviation Weather Unit, you can find all of that information with just a couple clicks. And if you can't find what you're looking for, feel free to email me. Many of you do, and I'm happy to talk to you anytime. And I'd love to see pictures of where you are in your Alaska and what you're seeing. The fall is certainly a beautiful time, and especially as the weather is generally quiet across a large part of Alaska, and unusually so. So let me know what it looks like where you are. david.snyder@noaa.gov. I'd love to see your pictures. Here's a look at what's going on in Southeast. As many of you have already experienced a couple times in the last few days, it's gotten kind of cold at night, and we have a lot of high pressure up across the interior of Alaska, and we have a trough of low pressure across parts of east and southeastern Alaska. That's draining colder air in, but if those winds stop, that really allows some of that coldest air to sink into the valleys. Imagine a bowl, and as colder air moves in, the dense air wants to go down toward the bottom of that bowl, and that's exactly what happens when we don't have any winds blowing through the canals or those nooks and crannies of southeastern Alaska. That colder air is allowed to settle down in the bottom of the bowl instead of stirring it up all the time. So if we're not stirring this air up, conditions can cool off fairly quickly. And it looks like tonight around Cake and Petersburg and Wrangell and probably up around Yakutat, that air might get really still, just long enough that frost could form on some of your plants. So a frost advisory is posted for tonight and into early tomorrow morning for Yakutat, Wrangell, and Cake and Petersburg. In these regions, it looks like temperatures could drop to about 30 to 35 degrees overnight. It's that time of the year, but certainly precautions can still be made. You might want to bring your plants in if you're able, or just cover them up with a soft, breathable material, and that might keep the frost off your plants for at least a couple more nights before we start getting into that harder freeze. When freezes are more likely, we'll have a freeze watch or a freeze warning, letting you know that the growing season is quickly coming to an end. Here's a look at the satellite picture today, and you'll notice clouds across a large part of south central, southwest, and even a little bit over southeast, though most of the southeastern clouds are up around the higher terrain and just kind of sneaking their way into Haida Gwaii, maybe bumping in on the southern edge. Low pressure is also sitting across the western Aleutians, and as that's moving eastward, you're starting to see that southerly flow bringing more cloud cover there. Stronger winds and gales are expected out across the west as we get into later tonight and eventually into tomorrow. Across a large part of the central and northern, even the eastern interior, we're looking at generally dry weather there. There is a front, again, that's stretching across the Alcan border, and on the eastern side of that is where a lot of that cooler air is remaining. On the western side, we're still seeing that very mild flow coming in. At times it does have some showers with it, and maybe later tonight and into tomorrow, there will be a possibility for a few spots across Norton Sound and Kotzebue Sound to actually experience a little bit of convection or shower and thunderstorm activity. It should be fairly isolated, but it certainly might be something you notice. Here's a look at the weather map today. A very slow-moving boundary lingers across the Brooks Range. On the north side of that, we're seeing areas of fog with high pressure pushing in that Arctic moisture right up against the central and eastern Beaufort Seacoast. Another high is sitting here across southern Yukon, very close to Dawson. And out across the open waters of the Gulf, low pressure sitting right over there, around 1,010 millibars or so. This is sloshing in clouds across southern parts of southeast, but for the most part, our weather's fairly dry. There are a few areas that are seeing some light rainfall, some of those across southwest, some around McGrath and the western parts of the Alaska Range. But by and large, high pressure across the central Aleutians is really holding its ground, still controlling the weather across most of the last frontier. As we get into tonight, one of those waves makes its way onshore, and we'll probably see some areas of fog and drizzle with that. So if you're planning to fly tomorrow around the Yukon Delta down toward the Kuskokwim Delta, or even northbound heading toward the Seward Peninsula into the Kotzebue Sound region, you're probably going to have to wait a little while and hope for some breaks. You'll have a much better chance the further east you go of finding those breaks. But for many locations across the Bering Sea and the West Coast, you're going to be looking at IFR and MVFR conditions as we get into tomorrow. You'll see that in our aviation maps coming up in a few. Watch for some showers across the Alaska Range and maybe some parts around the Kenai Peninsula and certainly Kodiak Island. Low pressure has a trough extending westward across the open waters of the Gulf, and for most places in the southeast, you're looking at dry weather. And remember, still weather. That's the key with that frost advisory that we're talking about around Yakutat, Petersburg, Wrangell, and Cake tonight. A look out west shows high pressure still firmly anchored across the central chain. You're not going to see it move a whole lot in the next couple maps. And out west, low pressure is going to move a little bit more to the east. As that happens, that southerly flow has to strengthen to make up for the high pressure system not moving. So the pressure gradient out here is going to get tighter. And we all know, because I love to talk about it so much, that means that wind's going to really have to pick up out across the west. So watch for that to happen, especially west of Adak. Up north around the Chukchi coast, showers are expected as we get into tonight and tomorrow. You'll see that continuing for your Tuesday. There's that pesky stationary boundary once again. You may like it if you're not ready for cold air, but there certainly is some cooler weather on the eastern side as high pressure is working its way out over the Arctic. As low pressure sits in the same spot just south and west of Craig and Klawock, it may slosh some clouds up into the southern parts of southeast. By and large, again, very quiet, dry weather will continue for southeast. So what does that mean for some of the places looking at a frost advisory tonight? You might be back in similar position again tomorrow night. As you look across the middle and upper Yukon Valley, or I should say the upper Kuskokwim Valley and the middle Yukon Valley, and the Kobuk and Noatak Valley, showers are possible there. Low pressure sits up across areas close to the Bering Strait, and high pressure hasn't budged, 1,034 millibars there. But here comes that low. It's nudging in on that high pressure territory, and so remember, that means the wind flow here has to get stronger, and it does, and that means that gales are a little more likely as we head into Tuesday. For Wednesday, low pressure quickly zips up toward the Bering Strait. High pressure hasn't budged. The strongest winds will be from Kiska to about Adak as we head into Wednesday afternoon. And there's our thunderstorm symbol once again. That means that shower and thunderstorm activity may be a little more likely in those regions. It doesn't look like it'll be a tremendous outpouring of thunderstorms, but there might be a lightning strike or a little bit of thunder and lightning in your area. If you hear that or see that, it's a good time to remember to step inside for a few minutes, let that storm pass and fizzle out. It will, and it'll do so fairly quickly, but make sure to give it some space and wait about 30 minutes or so for that to happen. Showers will continue across the eastern Alaska Range into the middle Tanana Valley. Most areas around Cook Inlet, southward toward Kodiak Island, should be generally dry and sunny. And you'll find similar conditions across parts of southeast with low pressure hanging out toward Hainaguai. The coldest air is still off to our north and east, so everything you see here, despite being cloudy and rainy and probably damp at some times, isn't going to be that cold compared to where we may be in other parts of the different years in September. A really active weather still way out to the west, but there are some signs of change as we get into the end of this week and into next week. We may start to see this very mild weather pattern, calling it quits, especially after a very dry September in many locations. Let's take a look at those temperatures. For southeast, it looks like we may see some cold spots, and one of the forecast models we're showing here has places around Gustavus dropping into the 20s tonight. That would be a pretty hard freeze. I'm not sure if it's going to be quite that cold, but don't be surprised. Places around Yakutat, Craig, Klawock, and Petersburg, and not so much Klawock. Forgive me, I didn't mean to say Klawock. Craig, and let me try this again and just erase all that. Let's try Yakutat, Wrangell, Petersburg, all looking at cooler temperatures from about 30 to 35 degrees. Those places are looking at frost advisories. As you get into the upper Tanana Valley, we're looking at temps that are close to freezing. For Yukon, about 34. Up north, 20s and 30s there, but south and west, very mild. Mid to upper 40s. South central, you're looking at mid to upper 40s as well. Highs tomorrow still back in the 50s and 60s. Mid 50s around the Tanana Valley and Fairbanks. Fort Yukon bounces back to 50 degrees. Southwest, also anywhere from 50 to about 60 degrees. 49 in Nome, 37 for Utqiagvik, and 51 around St. Paul. 50s and 60s for southeast. Wednesday morning, again, we're going to see some cool spots here in southeast. Some of those could be in the lower 30s to mid 30s there. And if that happens, frost could be a possibility where you are again. Lower 40s for South Central, Kodiak 48. Looks like some parts around the McKinley Park, Healy area could be nearing 40 degrees, 34 around Eagle, 20s for the Beaufort Seacoast, and overnight lows in the 40s for Southwest, with highs for many back in the 40s, 50s, and close to 60 in Southeast.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Moving on to aviation weather now, IFR conditions will be fairly widespread again in the morning for St. Paul, St. George, all the way out toward the central and even western Aleutians toward Kiska, Nikolsky, Unalaska and Dutch Harbor, and also the Bering Sea coast along the Alaska Peninsula. You'll see some of that breaking up in the morning around Dillingham, but as you get further south and east toward Lake Iliamna and then southward toward Naknek and King Salmon, you'll probably start to run into a little bit more MVFR as the day goes on. IFR conditions continue across the Alaska Range, and then pushing south central into the Cook Inlet region, you're looking at a little bit more of a marginal deck there, and into Prince William Sound, VFR. Looking at most of southeast, VFR conditions should prevail, and this is going to be a trend that you'll be stuck with most of the week. I know some of you will be really disappointed in that. Out across the middle and upper Yukon, as well as the Brooks Range, things look pretty good to start. IFR conditions may be just east of Point Barrow and into Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse, with MVFR conditions just a little bit further east, though VFR for Kaktovik. MVFR conditions through a large part of the Bering Strait. And then as we go throughout the day, you'll notice a transition toward more of an MVFR type situation from the Kobuk and Noatak valleys all the way down to the Alaska Range. Cook Inlet looks pretty good, but a large part of the Kenai Peninsula and South Central will experience marginal conditions through most of the day. As we get out toward the Bering Sea, hit and miss IFR. Some of that will be very near St. Paul and St. George, and the central chain is expecting to see IFR through most of the afternoon. Once again, southeast, northern parts of the Gulf looking A-OK. As we get into Wednesday morning, a patch of upward moving air may present us with an opportunity for convection. Shower or thunderstorm activity may be a little more likely in this region as we get into Wednesday morning around Norton Sound, Unalakleet, up toward the southern coast of the Seward Peninsula. Most folks will probably be dealing with marginal conditions and ceilings through a good chunk of the morning, but we do expect to see IFR across some of your northern and western Alaska Range passes. Through parts of the Kenai, expect widespread MVFR. The Alaska Peninsula all the way out toward the central and western chain, at least looking at marginal conditions, and some places we'll start to see a little bit more IFR. Now, as we get into the afternoon, we'll have a little bit broader area of convection, so shower and storm activity may be possible across the Kotzebue Sound region, as well as the northern Yukon Delta. That should not spread inland very much, but we will see lower decks and ceilings as we get into the Alaska Range and parts of the southern Tanana Valley, as well as areas across the Brooks Range there and just north of Point Barrow. IFR a little more likely for St. Paul and St. George and the western Aleutian chain. And once again, notice southeast is A-OK for your Wednesday afternoon. Here's your pass conditions now. Anaktuvik and Adigan Pass, we expect to see VFR all day long. Things look pretty good there. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass will start at IFR, but a lean over toward marginal conditions should be expected as the day goes on. Rainy Pass, IFR conditions through most of the day. We'll see the start in Windy Pass, but marginal conditions will continue as the afternoon goes on. Isabel Pass, marginal conditions most of the day there, and we expect to see marginal visibility and ceilings mostly in Mentasta Pass. As we get into Tenita Pass, we'll get to marginal conditions, but probably a start in the region around IFR as you go through your Tuesday morning. Marginal levels there most of the day in Portage Pass doesn't look too terrible. And then as you get over to Chilkoot White Pass, things look A-OK. And again, that should be the trend really for most of the week, not all the week, but most of the week in the northern passes there for southeast. Notice there's some cooler weather across north and western parts of Canada. You get over to the Alcan and those levels come up just a little bit more, but a trough in the upper atmosphere is pushing that colder air down across the west coast. Out west over the Bering, you can see the effects of high pressure allowing that warmth to build back above 4,000 feet for your freezing levels. So most of the mainland, though, at or even just below that 4,000 foot freezing line. What about icing? Well, you have to go pretty high up there to get into any isolated moderate risk, generally above 10,000 feet. There is moisture to be had, but right now those levels are still fairly high up there, so not a huge concern for general aviation. Here's that trough of low pressure across the west. You can see most areas are under the influence of this building ridge. This may be the last one, though. If the patterns are correct, it does look like we'll get into a little bit more of a trough and unsettled weather as we go into late next week. In the meantime, south and westerlies are strongest across the western Bering, 40 to 50 knots there. Most of the mainland under Wind speeds around 10 to 20 knots, a little bit of a stronger flow over Norton Sound. You can see wind speeds here across the southwest up to 25 knots, but again, at 3,000 feet, most areas sitting at levels between 10 and about 20 knots there, with a general south and westerly flow coming into the mainland. What about turbulence? Well, the fastest winds are out across the western chain, and that's where we see the considerable moderate showing up there, generally below about 4,000 feet from just west of Adak to about Shemya.
On March 11, 2011, a powerful tsunami hit Japan, destroying cities and villages. As the water receded back into the ocean, it pulled what remained of buildings, cars, boats, and homes along with it. Scrap metals, plastics, and objects of all shapes and sizes either sank near the shore or floated away. In the days that followed, large masses of floating debris could easily be seen by satellite imagery and aerial photos. In the wake of this disaster, NOAA is assessing the potential impact that the debris may have on U.S. shores. So, where will this debris go, and when will it get there? To help answer those questions, scientists are using computer models to estimate the debris' path, using its starting location in the tsunami zone and historical weather and ocean conditions. The findings are that some debris could pass near or wash ashore in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands as early as this winter. Debris may also approach the west coast of the United States in 2013 and potentially circle back to the main Hawaiian Islands in 2014. But scientists caution that there are limitations to what computer models can tell us, now that the debris has moved out of satellite view, and with currents and winds in the Pacific constantly changing, there is no guarantee that the debris will stay on the predicted path. Items will sink along the way, or break up and disperse in many directions. Despite these unknowns, NOAA and its partners are collecting data, assessing possible impacts, and making preparations in case debris does wash ashore. The 2011 tsunami in Japan reminds us that the devastation that happens on land can also become a marine debris issue at sea.
Imagine all of this underwater. In a major tsunami, it could happen. In this part of Washington state, it's happened before, hundreds of years ago. Sometime in the future, it will likely happen again. But we can be ready. If a tsunami strikes, this school will provide a place for people to ride it out above the waves.
We're in Westport, Washington, and right behind me is the very first tsunami vertical evacuation center in the United States.
This is an emergency. Please walk to the nearest exit.
Let's go.
Go to the stair tower and proceed up the stairs.
Tsunamis are a potential hazard for low-lying coastal areas. That's why many coastal communities have plans in place to get people to safety, high ground or inland, where they can be beyond the reach of a tsunami. Often there are signs showing where to go and where to gather. Most tsunamis are caused by underwater earthquakes along subduction zones, where two of Earth's plates collide and one is forced under the other. Westport and other Pacific Northwest coastal communities are especially at risk because one of these zones lies just offshore. It's called the Cascadia Subduction Zone. An earthquake here caused a tsunami in 1700 that flooded shores as far away as Japan. Experts say it's just a matter of time before it happens again. Since the subduction zone is so close, a tsunami like the one in 1700 could strike before people in some low-lying areas could get to high ground or inland. And Westport doesn't have a lot of high ground or easy routes inland.
If we get an earthquake or a tsunami, we're going to get a lot of water in the area really quickly, and we needed a place to go. So our community built this brand new school, and above our gym and cafeteria, we have a roof. And so the idea is that we'll get all of our students up, and anybody from the community who needs to get up, they can get up there as well.
Ocosta Elementary School might seem like a normal school, but look more closely. It's engineered to withstand monster waves. Tsunami vertical evacuation shelters must be able to resist the powerful forces that a tsunami brings. Hydrodynamic, buoyant, hydrostatic, and debris impact forces and strong currents. They're also designed to help people get to safety quickly.
There are 4 big staircases on each corner of the building, and each one of those staircases is 8 feet wide, and we can get the whole school evacuated in about 4.5 minutes.
Everybody should be at a 0.
On the roof of the building, there is water and food and buckets and shelters and tarps and blankets and different things so that we can be up there for 2, 3, maybe 4 days while we wait for rescue.
You can go to the top and you know you'll be safe. It feels really nice to have a special building because you feel protected.
This community decided that a tsunami evacuation center was important because they didn't have anywhere to go, and they decided to use their money to build the building. The additional cost is anywhere between 10 and 20% of the actual building cost itself, and that's really a sound investment for a lot of protection. You may be there a while, but you're safe and you're secure, and that's the most important thing.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Onto your sea ice edge now. You'll notice that that multi-year ice, the pack ice, is still sitting north of Prudhoe Bay. Everything in blue is still the marginal ice zone, and it hasn't really changed a whole lot in the last couple of weeks, right? We've been talking about this chunk of ice pretty much staying in the same old spot, and it doesn't look like it's going to move a whole lot more. And in fact, we're actually growing new ice, most of that well to the north, but along this boundary here, there is new ice forming. So that process is beginning, even as we're still melting some ice out in the west. So it's still a little bit of a balancing act. We haven't probably flipped over into total ice growth mode yet, but you know what's coming. It's that time of the year. September 17th is what you're looking at here. Anytime you want to check out the very latest information about sea ice and the forecast to come, not to mention the seasonal outlook, make sure you head to weather.gov/Anchorage/ice. Here's a look at the marine forecast now for southeast. Winds are going to be staying fairly light through the next 24 hours. Remember, we're talking about some places probably becoming pretty calm, which means frost is possible in those regions around Yakutat, Petersburg, as we get into Wrangell, places like that, and Cake. Look for a gentle southerly breeze up the Lynn Canal tomorrow. 10 knots, 2-foot seas, northwesterlies inside the Clarence Strait, and a little bit of a stronger offshore flow south of Port Alexander down to the Dixon entrance. 20 knots there with about a 6-foot sea. As we get into Wednesday, no big changes, but we're going to lose some of that stronger flow here across the southern parts of southeast. Looking at light winds inside of Clarence Strait, 5 knots there, gentle from the northwest, 2-foot seas. Northerlies a little stronger in the Lynn Canal and flipping around, and look for more of a northwesterly flow coming down the outer coast. 10 to 15 knots with 3 to 4-foot seas for your Wednesday. For Tuesday in south central, light winds all the way around 10 knots, 2 to 3-foot seas at most. One exception would be just across the eastern Barren Islands there. A little bit more from the southwest with a 4-foot sea. Inside of Prince William Sound, things look pretty good. Northwesterlies, 2-foot seas there for tomorrow. And pretty much a ditto on Wednesday. Northwesterlies, 2-foot seas for Wednesday. A little bit of a stronger flow across the Barrens, 20 knots with 5-foot seas for the midweek. Otherwise, a gentle northwesterly flow for just about every location. For Tuesday, Bristol Bay, northwesterlies, 4-foot seas. They're north and westerly winds coming across the southern part of the Ak Pen. Northwesterlies inside of Shelikof Strait, looking at about 3 to 4 foot seas as you get out into the western Gulf east of Kodiak Island and from AKwx down toward Perryville on Tuesday. Look for 15-knot winds in all areas on Wednesday. 3 foot seas around Shelikof Strait and down the Pacific coastline. 4 foot seas for the Bering Sea coast there on that westerly 15-knot wind. And it'll carry about the same conditions there east of Kodiak Island and AKwx as we head into your Wednesday. Out west, remember we were talking about the winds coming up, and there they are. Southerlies there working into gales. 18-foot seas expected there as we get into your Tuesday, with otherwise 3 to 4 foot seas for most regions across the central and eastern chain. Southerlies a little stronger between Adak and Kiska, 25 knots and a 7-foot sea. Those winds kind of mix out a little bit more as we get into Wednesday. That gradient relaxes, and we're back into 15 to 25 knot winds with 5 to 6 foot seas for many locations. 11-foot seas still holding on in the west. The seas take a little longer to calm down, as you know, and 3 to 8 foot seas across the Pacific coast with a south and westerly flow. For the west coast, 15 to 20 knots in most locations. Inside of Norton Sound, 15 knots, 3 foot seas, 15 knots and 4 foot seas for St. Paul and St. George. Look for a west and southwest flow around St. Matthew, 20 knots there on a 5-foot sea. And here comes that push of wind and higher seas gradually making their way to St. Matthew. 11-foot seas by Wednesday, 5-foot seas for St. Paul and St. George on a 20-knot wind that's blowing in from the south and west toward the YK Delta. Looking at a little bit more of a westerly flow inside of Norton Sound and around St. Lawrence Island. A little bit further north, southerlies for the Chukchi coast, 15 knots there with 3 to 4 foot seas. A stronger easterly flow across the Beaufort, 6-foot seas on a 25 to 30 knot wind. And you'll notice winds diminishing just a little bit more on Wednesday there. Seas still holding to 5 to 6 feet in the open waters, and east and southeasterly flow becomes a little bit lighter around the Chukchi coast, 10 knots there with 2 to 3 foot seas. Recapping tonight's weather, as the winds start to calm down around Petersburg, Wrangell, Hake, and up toward Yakutat, you could have some frost tonight. Temperatures are expected to go to about 30 to 35 degrees. And remember, if you've got some sensitive plants, now is the time to bring them in if you're in those communities. Look for showers to the north and west as low pressure moves in. High pressure remains anchored around the Bering. That means poor visibility and low ceilings for most of our western locations, including St. Paul and St. George, and a large chunk of the Aleutians, of course. For Tuesday, as that front squeezes in, winds come out across the western chain. Most of southeast stays dry again this week. Some sunny breaks across south central and Kodiak Island, showers and maybe even a brief thunderstorm across some of our western locations in the Seward Peninsula and the Yukon Delta. Thanks for watching.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.